A few weeks ago, a proposal was made for the Servo project to allow for AI contribution, which are currently prohibited. The proposal comes with strict guidelines. Only allow code for code completion, like Copilot, tag all AI contribution as so, and more. After a few weeks of intense, believe me, discussion, the Servo Technical Steering Committee decided not to go forward with the proposal and keep the AI policy as it is now. Namely, this policy states that all contributions must not include content generated by LLM or other probabilistic tools, including but not limited to Copilot or ChatGPT. This covers both code and documentation generation. You might be wondering why they have decided to take this path. Well, it comes down to 4 reasons. Firstly, AI makes it easy to generate lengthy but incorrect diffs, which the contributor might not check or test. It becomes then the responsibility of the maintainer to go through that and realize that it's actually incorrect. Secondly, code generation by AI has no guarantee of being correct, and it might have security issues. Again, contributors using AI tools might not be able or want to catch those issues manually. Thirdly, copyright. We know that these large models are trained on copyrighted content, and Servo claims that their output often includes that content verbatim, which would expose Servo to potential legal headaches. And finally, there are ethical issues. According to Servo, AI models require an unreasonable amount of energy and water to build and operate. Their models are built with heavily exploited workers in unacceptable working conditions, and they are being used to undermine labor and justify layoffs. The project does not want to perpetuate those issues even indirectly. What's interesting is that Servo is not the only project that takes this stance, but an increasing amount of repositories are now off limits for AI-generated code. As an example, Loupe, which is GNOME's image viewer application, also recently added a section about generative AI on their contributor guidelines. This policy states, and I quote, "This project does not allow contributions generated by large language models and chatbots. We are taking these steps as a precaution due to potential negative influence of AI-generated code on quality, as well likely copyright violations. This ban of AI-generated content applies to all parts of the project, including, but not limited to, code documentation, issues, and artworks." A month later, this guideline was added by Alice to GNOME's Elastic, libadwaita, libmanet, libhighscore, and the highscore application. I wouldn't be surprised to see this list grow over time. And 3 weeks ago, ElementaryOS also added the same policy directly taken from Loupes. AI code is a no-go there too. Other older examples of this are NetBSD, which explicitly states that code generated by LLMs is presumed to be tainted code and must not be committed without prior written approval by core. And finally, there's Gentoo. It is expressly forbidden to contribute to Gentoo any content that has been created with the assistance of natural language processing artificial intelligence tools. So let's discuss this decision on its merits. I just cannot speak today. I want to firstly point out the obvious and address the very first question that was raised on each of these discussions, which is, how will they know which code is AI generated? And the answer is that there's no way to know for certain. All of these guidelines are entirely unenforceable. A few people claim that they can tell whether a large contribution is made by AI, and I do believe that we can mark some contributions as most likely written by those tools, but I also believe that we cannot ban people on most likely considerations or personal intuitions. Either the author admits to AI usage, or the request is entirely based on trust between the contributor and the project. Though, as Sophie points out, the same applies to people owning the code that they are submitting. There's no way for certain for a project to check whether the submitted code isn't just stolen by the contributor from elsewhere. Personally, I am not completely sold on this equivalence. When I submit code to an open source project, I am taking legal responsibility for it, and if it's stolen, then I will get into trouble. It does not, however, limit how I can write my code. Instead, the AI section is trying to limit the kind of tools that I can use to write my code, such as whether I can use autocompletion, and this is a much stronger request. I'm not even convinced that a project has the right to make this request to a contributor. To make an example, if there were a text editor that was, I don't know, made by a fascist and whose owner said some truly disgraceful things, I don't know, would a project be justified in prohibiting contributors from using that text editor to write the code to submit? And I believe they wouldn't, as it should be instead the choice of the contributor themselves, though the project can surely ask. As another user points out in the Loupe discussion, the kind of person who will contribute large patches entirely generated by AI is most likely also the kind of inexperienced contributor that's willing to ignore contributor guidelines. And if they do ignore the guidelines, there won't be any way to punish them, as there's no way to know for sure that the code is AI generated, and certainly you don't want to ban people by mistake. From the same thread, Emanuele Bassi adds that the only people that end up using LLMs are people that are not learning to code but want to submit something anyway. And I also take issue with this claim. Though I won't deny that there are plenty of people who do use AI tools to avoid learning a certain language, I also see plenty of people already skilled. People use it to speed up their workflow, myself included. As an example, I've been using Python my entire life, and I've even given multiple talks about at PyCon about the language and some of its more obscure aspects. I'm not a great Python developer. I'm not a great developer at all, but I can quickly get things done using it. That said, I often use AI to generate parts of some Python scripts because it's easier and it gets it right almost every time actually, and it's significantly faster for me to check that something is written correctly rather than to write it myself from scratch. It provides a starting point. And yeah, I can always make some changes to the code where I think it's needed. Of course, since I do know Python, I make sure that the generated code makes sense to me, complete sense to me, and works properly. All code that I submit to any project is code that I would have written like that, and I take full responsibility for it. I won't deny the existence of people who just copy-paste from ChatGPT without having a clue of what they're doing, obviously. But what about all the other claims, like legal issues, the impact of climate change, and more? Legally speaking, unless there are other contributor agreements in place or employment situations, all contributors preserve the ownership of their contributors. All contributors preserve ownership of their contributions. I can do this to open source projects. If it turns out that a certain piece of code was stolen by the contributor, they will be the ones that will get in trouble for it. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not a lawyer and I didn't find much about this. The same would happen if the code submitted by the contributor turned out to be taken as is from another project. This means that the decision of whether to take this legal risk or not falls on the shoulder of the contributor and not of the project, which would be unaffected. I believe that the same applies to the ethical and climate issues of AI tools. Though it's important to raise awareness of the AI problems, I believe it's ultimately the contributor's choice whether or not to use these tools despite that. Again, I decide to use AI tools because I'm currently convinced that the claims about climate impact are overblown, and I believe that using copyrighted material for training is fair use, though I do take issue with the usage of underpaid third world workers for alignment. And of course, I'm willing to change my mind if presented with more evidence, so feel free to send me links in my emails or Telegram. I think this should be ultimately my choice, or at worst my employee's choice, instead of the choice of the project that I'm contributing to. Really, since I believe that they don't have legal responsibility for it, I believe the only impact that a project has to deal with is the additional maintainer's burden of reviewing completely bogus AI merge requests, which do exist, not denying that. However, I also believe that this policy will be entirely ineffective at stopping this for the reasons that I explained before. Going further, I'm a bit shocked by some of the replies that the Servo proposal for allowing just AI autocompletion in code received. As an example, user multiple aliases wrote that a good chunk of people are going to see this and consider Servo tainted. Merely entertaining AI these days is a statement, and that statement is, we don't care about quality, we don't care about contributors, all hail the slop machine. And if you think about it, this statement is pretty shocking. Like, almost all of open source projects currently have no guidelines for AI, only a few ones do. And by this logic, the entire open source world, with only a handful of exceptions, is tainted. The same applies to developer McClure, I don't know how to pronounce that, who would have stopped donating and contributing to the project if the proposal had been approved, as they will not contribute code to a project where you don't know if the code you're interacting with was written by a human or randomly generated. Again, this means not donating nor contributing to the entirety of open source, with only a few exceptions. It seems to me like these comments completely fail to take in account the broader context of the open source world, where AI contributions are currently accepted almost everywhere. And this is to be found like throughout the thread, even though the proposed AI policy would still be significantly more strict than almost every other open source project, since it only allows for code completion and requires tagging of AI generated code. People would still be considering Servo as actively embracing AI. There's even someone who says that they will never use Servo because it contains AI-generated code, which again forgets how the vast majority of open source projects, even open source ones, the vast majority of software projects, even open source ones, contain AI-generated code by now. Of course, the overwhelmingly negative feedback on the proposal eventually prompted the technical steering committee to change their minds and not go forward with it. I would have done the same at this point. Though I can understand hostility towards AI tools, and I'm frustrated myself at the over-promises and the hype bubble which do exist, I nonetheless think that there's a lot of irrationality when discussing AI. Like, as an example, in my opinion, the video by the Linux experiment where he says that we would ditch Firefox. Though, again, in my opinion, the fundamental issue was a lack of understanding of the actual policy changes. He started saying that it didn't trust Mozilla anymore, and he believed that it would start selling data to AI companies, even though there was no evidence of that whatsoever. It was completely irrational. And I also believe it is a bit irrational to try to force contributors to avoid specific tools where there is no way to enforce that, or ever ban a bad actor who would lie about using them. And I think it would be more useful to continue to advocate against AI through other means. So how many subscribers did I just lose today?